my name is Corey Pierce, and today I'll be presenting the Great Depression and the gold standard. The U.S. economy is bouncing back pretty effectively to the COVID-19 pandemic. Much of its success and its comeback is related to the assistance from the Federal Reserve and the U.S. government. There was a time in U.S. history when the recovery from an economic crisis wasn't as great. An example of this is the Great Depression. And one of the biggest reasons that the Great Depression lasted so long and didn't bounce back so effectively was because it was on the gold standard. While the gold standard and its adherence to it by the US wasn't the only reason, it is one of the most significant causes of the Great Depression and for it to last so long. So to understand why the Great Depression was prolonged by the gold standard, we need to understand what the gold standard is. The gold standard is a monetary system where the value of a country's currency is directly related to gold. A country that uses the gold standard sets a fixed price for gold to sell and buy gold at that price. The fixed price of gold is used to determine the value of a currency. For example, if the US sets the price of gold at $500 per ounce, then a dollar would be worth 1/500th of an ounce of gold. Some other information about the gold standard is that the gold standard is a type of fixed exchange rate system. It uses the price species flow mechanism, which is the adjustment of prices as gold flows into and out of a country. An inflow of gold tends to inflate prices, while an outflow of gold tends to deflate prices. These flows from the gold standard are used to help stabilize the balance of payments. So these statistics here comparing the Great Depression versus the Great Recession of 2008, it really shows the difference of how the Federal Reserve and the US government have gotten better at applying monetary and fiscal policy to improve economic conditions. So the Great Depression, the real GDP fell by 30%, while in the Great Recession it only fell by 4.3%. Also in the Great Depression, unemployment rate was over 20% compared to only about 10% in the Great Recession. And some other information is that in the Great Depression, industrial production declined by 47%, and the consumer price index fell by 33%. So here's some history leading to the Great Depression. The US economy was booming during the first part of the 1920s, with the construction and automobile industries driving the recovery from World War I. To counter inflation, the US raised its interest rates in 1928. Many European countries that borrowed money from the US during the war had trouble paying off their debts, causing a decrease in demand for US exports. A slowed economy combined with the stock market crash of 1929 and bank failures in 1930 and 1931 caused high levels of deflation. With high levels of deflation, the public began to hoard gold. People hoarded gold because they knew that gold had value no matter what, unlike the dollar, which has no inherent value besides the value that we give it. So to understand the gold standard further, we need to understand monetary and fiscal policy. Monetary policy refers to the activities of a central bank that influence the supply of money and the credit within an economy. Fiscal policy refers to a government's decision about spending and taxation. Both fiscal and monetary policies are used to help economic conditions foster economic growth while maintaining a steady rate of healthy inflation. While under the gold standard, fiscal and monetary policy are difficult to use because all of the money used for these policies must be backed by gold rather than government debt. So what effect did the gold standard have on the Great Depression? The gold standard didn't cause the Great Depression, but limited the US's ability to fight deflation. With the gold standard, expansionary monetary policy was discouraged. The central bank could have given loans to troubled banks, which could have kept those banks in business. Due to the gold standard, the Federal Reserve was discouraged to give the help that was needed. Expansionary monetary policy would have decreased the government's gold holdings, which would make people doubt the US's commitment to the gold standard. At the time, the US had large gold reserves, so some losses of gold likely wouldn't have hurt the US's adherence to the gold standard. The Federal Reserve ended up not acting because expansionary actions would have led to expectations of devaluation and rapid losses of gold. Devaluation of the dollar would have impacted the fixed exchange rate of gold, increasing the number of dollars needed for an ounce of gold. Without the gold standard, the Federal Reserve could have used expansionary monetary policy to help slow the negative economic impact of the Great Depression. The actions taken to maintain the gold standard. During the Great Depression, the Federal Reserve purposely raised interest rates and reduced the money supply by 1/3 in an effort to maintain the gold standard. Higher interest rates lower aggregate demand, which in turn helped assist in the decrease of GDP. In the Fed's efforts to maintain the gold standard, it actually did the opposite of what the economy needed at the time. At the time, the economy needed a larger money supply and lower interest rates to encourage economic activity. Here's some further gold standard history. In 1933, President Roosevelt took the U.S. off of the gold standard with the Gold Reserve Act. This bill made it illegal for the public to own most forms of gold and required people to exchange their gold for $20.67 per ounce. Being off the gold standard allowed FDR to launch the New Deal from 1933 to 1939, creating many programs that helped provide relief to farmers and provided jobs to the unemployed. FDR also passed the Emergency Banking Act, which closed all banks until they were examined to be financially secure. This act, combined with the abandonment of the gold standard, was crucial to the U.S.'s economy recovery. Without the gold standard, FDR was able to spend the money needed to stimulate the economy with his policies from the New Deal. In addition, giving people faith in banks combated one of the core issues that helped create the Great Depression in the first place. So here are some quotes that demonstrate the different views of the gold standard at the time. So from John Maynard Keynes in 1924, he said, "In truth, the gold standard is already a barbarous relic." And an opposing view is Herbert Hoover, which he was for the gold standard, said, "We have gold because we cannot trust governments." In conclusion, while no single aspect of the Great Depression was the only cause for it, the gold standard and the Fed's decision to maintain it caused many problems. Luckily, the U.S. was able to learn from the mistakes of the Great Depression, which lasted about a decade, compared to the Great Recession, which only lasted 18 months. We will continue to use the information that we've learned from the past recessions to get out of the COVID-19 recession, which we're doing pretty well at this point. And here are my sources.